Welcome to the Disciple Standard podcast. We've got a great show in store for you today. Today, we're going to be talking about the power of being decentralized. In fact, we're going to talk about starfish and spiders. So buckle up. It's going to be great. We'll give you an update, as we always do, about how our system is multiplying. And then I've got a great interview with my friend Greg Hauenstein, the president of Mintz Seminary, one of the most remarkable seminaries at work in this world today. You're not going to want to miss it. At any rate, let's get started. All right, and the topic for today, I'd like to talk about something that I think is important. Jake, we've been talking about upgrading the operating system of the church, and I'd like to talk about moving it from a centralized model to a decentralized model. And I think what we have going in our multiply movement and the disciple standard is we're teaching and we're promoting a new operating system that's not centralized, but decentralized. And I came across a good book. In fact, later on the show, we're going to have Greg Hauenstein, who is the president of Mintz Seminary, is one of my disciples. He actually handed me a book. This is the book, The Starfish and the Spider. And it's all about the unstoppable power of leaderless organizations. And it talks about how powerful decentralized organizations are. And when I finished reading this, I said, oh, man, there it is. I've got to talk about this. And so, Jake, to everyone who's listening in, I'm recommending this book. I think it's a great book. It really describes well what we're trying to accomplish through the disciple standard. And anyway, let's talk about the book. So here's the basic premise of the book, that if you were to look at a spider and you were to look at a starfish, you might almost say, well, those are very similar to each other. In some cases, depending on the type of spider or the type of starfish, you might not even immediately tell them apart. I mean, the look and feel of them is so similar. But now here's the thing. If you were to take a spider and cut off one of its legs, I mean, maybe the spider would survive that. It'd just be a maimed spider walking around. But if you got 2 or 3 cut off, then probably the spider would die. And certainly if you were to cut off its head, I mean, the spider is done. In that very moment, everything else is, you cut off the head, spider's gone. Now, a starfish, like I said, it looks very much like a spider, but now there's no head. A starfish doesn't have a head. It's got the 5 or 6 arms, or however many is on a starfish. I'm sure each different species of starfish is a little different. But here's what's remarkable about a starfish. If you were to cut off a leg, what would wind up happening is not only would the original starfish grow the leg back, but the leg would grow a starfish. So you'd have 2. In fact, you could cut all 5 legs, and guess what you get?
5 new starfish.
5 starfish, which I think is amazing. So in other words, every leg contains within it the entire neural system and the entire biological system of the entire starfish. So think about it here. There's no head on a starfish. And so what this book talks about is it talks about how powerful it is when you create decentralized organizations like starfish as compared to central organizations like spiders. So we'll give some examples, and they give these examples in the book. They talk about how at one point, and this is probably now in the 90s, there are all these record companies that had labels, but they started to be swallowed up by really large record companies and labels, which were then, because they had a monopoly on things, it was like everyone was subject to the prices they had. And, if you were an artist, you couldn't do anything but publish with them. And anyway, what wound up happening was it became very centralized in just like one company, so to speak, or just a handful of companies that were a conglomerate working together. And then all of a sudden came out networks like this, Napster, that were like these peer-to-peer things where if you had music, you could just make your music available. If I had music, I could make my music available. And it wasn't like we had to go somewhere to get the music. Now just people were sharing peer-to-peer all music or films or movies. Now, when Napster first came out, I mean, this was like an industry disruptor. And eventually what wound up happening is these huge record companies wound up suing Napster. And to the extent that they were a little centralized, in other words, they had a home office or there were certain people who were doing it, they finally were able to prevail in the lawsuit and prevent Napster from being able to really function the way it had been. All that happened, though, was there were other entities that came up that were even less centralized. There was no one to sue. I mean, unless you literally were going to sue everybody who was using this, it would just be impossible. And so you had like Kazaa. And did you ever get involved in this at all? I mean, you're in media.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So
I was in the age of LimeWire, which I think was like right after Napster, like the early 2000s.
Okay.
And I got a lot of music from that.
Right. And since it was decentralized, it wasn't like there's a company out there who's, taking the music from these public. It's just people are sharing peer to peer. And it's almost like whatever flaw there was in Napster and in Kazaa, and okay, it must have been LimeWire finally, like the more decentralized it got, the stronger it got. Mm-hmm. The less, the centralized organizations could even do anything to harm it. You cut off one leg, it just regrows. Yeah. That's the idea. Here's another, in the book, they give this example of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so what happened was there was a man, Bill, who he himself was struggling with alcohol addiction, and he finally realized he needed help. And anyway, he's the one who came up with the idea of the 12 steps and how to finally help people, come out of, addiction to alcohol. And of course, that spun off into other areas as well, 12-step programs. And at some point, he started creating an organization that was beginning to help everyone. And he faced a choice at some point, which was he going to be the head of it? And everyone sort of had to report to him. And was this, was it going to be a centralized organization? He decided, you know what? No, I've developed a process. It's the 12 steps. And now, okay, Alcoholics Anonymous, literally, it doesn't matter what city or town you go to, really across the world, you'll be able to find chapters of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's no president. There's no board. There's no company that oversees it. Just there's an approved process that just pops up. People in a particular town, they begin to follow 12-step programs and help each other. And there might be another one over here that somehow becomes dysfunctional and winds up closing down. But no problem, another one pops up. And so I think really it's interesting. Most of us think, well, in order for something to run, there's got to be a head who's overseeing everything, and everyone has to respond to, the top person or the top entity. And anyway, Alcoholics Anonymous is a decentralized organization, and it doesn't matter. You could cut, 5 chapters out, and by tomorrow there'd be 5 more. You see the difference now, spider and starfish?
Yeah, I mean, when you put it that way, really, like, I never would have thought about that like that, and I think it's amazing.
Yeah. Now, if you read this book, they have kind of, I guess they call it the 8 pillars or, 8 aspects of what makes an organization decentralized. There's 2 that I'd like to talk about, and here's one of them. It talks about how an open system, like a decentralized system, doesn't have central intelligence. The intelligence is spread throughout the system. So in other words, if you think about like a spider, the knowledge of how to regrow or the knowledge of how to function is all located in the head. And if you cut that off, then like everything else is unintelligent. The legs, nothing can operate. But in a starfish, if you cut the leg off, like all the intelligence that's needed to regrow the entire starfish is contained in no matter what part of the system, like it's distributed, spread throughout the entire system. Now, the reason I think about this, I think about like a church. Often, and this we're talking about upgrading the operating system of church, often churches have functioned more like spiders. So I just think about an individual congregation. You have the pastor and maybe a few key leaders, and they're the ones that have the knowledge base of how to disciple people. And we might not tell people this straight out, but our intention is that if there's someone who needs to be discipled or there's ministry that needs to be done, then the congregation should be bringing them to the ones who have the intelligence to make the disciples, or however you think about it. In fact, I've got this next graphic, and I think actually this helps, what a centralized system looks like and what a network looks like. And among the things that I thought about is often our congregations look like, it's got a hierarchy. And I'm imagining, like you got that central person and there's like pews or chairs around that person. Give us the intelligence. Help us to know. But the disciple standard has this other idea that every single disciple's called to make a disciple. The knowledge of the gospel and the knowledge of how to make a disciple isn't residing in one person. It's everybody. All disciples make disciples. And so, this decentralized network looks a lot like what the church looks like, where everyone is entrusted with the gospel and then sent to make relationships around them. And there's a way in which God is Lord over this entire messy network. And we'd like to kind of make it hierarchical and comprehensible, and the power and the knowledge is, in the head. But I think actually the church is more like the picture on the right. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at it like this, it almost makes like if you're going to a church, you're at that bottom level, almost makes you feel like insignificant.
I know.
Like you're interchangeable, but being in a decentralized system really kind of puts everyone almost like an equal playing field.
Okay.
And I think that's incredible.
I agree, which now this is the second of these 8 pillars that I want to talk about. If you put people in an open system, they'll automatically want to contribute, which I think is interesting. And so an example, Wikipedia. So you have Encyclopedia Britannica and you have Wikipedia. Encyclopedia Britannica, there are these like tremendous PhD experts who are going to write out, they have all the knowledge and they're going to let the rest of us know about it. Then here comes Wikipedia along and it's like, hey, everybody knows stuff and everyone contribute to our knowledge. And what happens is in a closed system like Encyclopedia Britannica, like Jake, you and I mean, they're not going to invite us to write an article about anything because you need someone who's specially trained, who has a PhD, who's an accredited person. But with Wikipedia, it's like, hey, are you out there and you know something about this? Then go ahead and write. And like it created a system whereby anyone could contribute. And you'd say to yourself, well, who would contribute? Everybody. So, Wikipedia now, the amount of knowledge that's in that compared to the amount of knowledge that's in, Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, who even has Encyclopedia Britannica anymore? Everybody now just, you want to know about something? Go to Wikipedia. And that's because you've got an open system. People want to contribute. And now just to turn around and kind of apply that to the church. So you're right. If you have a hierarchical system where people think, well, I'm not a pastor, I'm not the person up on stage, I'm not one of the leaders, I'm just someone who's here attending, I sit in the pews. What do I have to give would be just a natural inclination or the outcome. But if you emphasize the disciple standard, look, are you a disciple of Jesus? You're called to make disciples. And you have this open system where you train people to become disciple makers and you expect that every disciple becomes a disciple maker. Next thing you know, the ownership will just go way up. Wonder if you have any thoughts about this.
Yeah. I mean, on the Wikipedia example, as you were saying, it's part of what I think too is like it's so much easier to read too. Like something that the Encyclopedia Britannica, it's written by high-minded people. It's going to be written high-minded. I can't read that.
That's such an interesting comment.
I go to Wikipedia for everything, and it's basically worded, and I love that about it.
Yeah, and maybe that's part of the problem with the old operating system of the church is what I think you're saying, right? Like, all right, we have these specially trained people who went and got their masters and advanced degrees, and they've learned Greek and Hebrew, and I don't know what they're talking about. But now if you have ordinary people who write Wikipedia, ordinary Christians who are making disciples, it's amazing how much more tangible and comprehensible Christianity becomes when given through ordinary people.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons, I mean, for me, how I explain it is like there's 4 gospels, right? And they all tell the same story 4 different ways. but it's from their perspectives and their life experiences. And I think it speaks to different people different ways.
I think you're exactly right. And anyway, I think this model, thinking of ourselves like starfish instead of spiders, we talk about, it's not that we're looking for superstar Christians that everyone can gather around. It's just ordinary people going out and being given an extraordinary opportunity to share the gospel, to disciple others. So much more powerful. Now, I think that if you were to really start to listen to the Bible, I think, we're always talking about upgrading the operating system of the church, but it's just to the original idea, to become more authentic to itself, almost like the church was meant to be decentralized, but we keep messing it up by trying to create a hierarchy and create a centralized system. I'm really been struck by, if you read the Old Testament prophets, and I've got a couple of examples here from Ezekiel 34. In Ezekiel 34, it says, "The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves." So, here's a complaint that in Old Testament times, the leaders who were put over people, who were supposed to explain to them the way of God and the word of God and take care of them in a godly way, that often they'd become selfish and self-interested. And so the sheep themselves suffered because they only existed for the shepherd's purpose. And at some point, of course, this has to do with like kings and rulers and leaders. And God's upset and said it's not going to be that way. So later in the chapter, it says, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I'll remove them from tending the flock. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them." And then at the end of the chapter it says, "Then they will know that I, the Lord their God, am with them, and that they, the Israelites, are my people, declares the sovereign Lord. You are my sheep, the sheep of my pasture, and I am your God, declares the sovereign Lord." So God's basically saying, look, there was maybe some kind of structure where God's leading the world, but then there were these shepherds who looked over the people of Israel, and God's like, all right, I'm going to move them out of the way. I'm just going to do it directly. I think that's the idea in Ezekiel 34. Same in Jeremiah 31. There's this promise of a new day. There's a very famous passage in the Old Testament. "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I'll make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I'll make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I'll put my law in their minds. I'll write it on their hearts. I'll be their God. They will be my people." In other words, it's not going to have to be mediated through someone else. It's going to be immediate. Like, it's not that someone's going to have to teach someone else, "Oh, let me tell you about God's law." No, it's going to be written right on our hearts. And now this: "No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, 'Know the Lord,' because they'll all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord." And so in Old Testament times, it might have been the case that there were people who were supposed to teach other people, and no one would really know about God if these shepherds, these rulers, weren't doing their job. But now God's saying, oh, look, there's going to be a new covenant, New Testament time, when it's going to be immediate. You'll know me. I'll know. Like, you don't need someone else to tell you know the Lord, because there'll be a direct relationship where God will directly be the shepherd to his sheep. And so instead of having a hierarchical organization where the people at the bottom can only know God if they have someone at the top who's dispensing them, no, it's more like the starfish, just God directly shepherds each one of us. And now, just to get to the New Testament, this is a verse I really think a lot about. At some point I felt called to become a pastor. This verse at least gives me some sense of what it is that pastors are supposed to be doing. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers. So there are some who are called to be apostles, some called to be prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, some teachers. Here's the reason: to equip his people, not their own people, whose people? God's people, for works of ministry, so that the body of Christ may be built up. Now notice here, who's doing the ministry? All God's people. And a pastor's job, my job, is just to equip them so that they can do the ministry. In the old hierarchical model, the pastor does the ministry, everyone else gathers around. But the Bible's so clear about this. God's people who are shepherded directly by him are called into ministry. Disciples make disciples. A pastor's there just to equip them and help them and create some, guidance or help so that they can be effective at what God's already called them to do. Anyway, any thoughts, Jake?
I love how it kind of gives different roles of like people in the church. Mm-hmm. I know for me, I'm not a pastor, but I would consider myself a teacher, right? Like I've poured into people like our intern Ethan or some of the kids at the school in our AV club. And, I think it kind of reaches everyone where they are. Mm-hmm. Like you could do ministry where you are. It doesn't have to only be, like you said, like in that head of the church. Like you don't have to be up top to make that difference.
And this verse makes it so clear. This hierarchical idea is all wrong. Mm-hmm. God's people, every one of them are called into ministry. A pastor's role is not to like lord over them anything as though I'm in charge and I know everything. And no, every Christian's called into ministry. My job is just to be a servant, to help people to do their ministry the best they can, to empower and equip them. And I think that's important. I guess the point I'm making is this. Once I read this book, Starfish and Spider, I realized that I think it's the case that if you just follow the analogy, the original intention of the church was to be a starfish organization where, it could multiply and reproduce. So you cut one leg off, no problem. You got 3 more. It was a decentralized model. But somehow the church just keeps centralizing it. Just keeps, if you think about the time of the Protestant Reformation, I mean, all the power is held by the Pope and a few bishops and, so Christ comes along and stirs it up, so to speak, right? And I think actually in recent times, the modern church has returned to a type of centralization where we're looking for superstar people who have extraordinary gifts. And no, the disciple standard it's about, we've got to go back to the starfish. I just love this. Anyway, that's the topic for today. We got to be decentralized. We got to think about ourselves like starfish rather than like spiders. So that's it. Interested in what you all think? Does this metaphor make sense to you? Would you like to know more? We'd love your feedback, your comments. So like and share. And now it's time for the next segment of our show, which is called The Tipping Point. Let's go. All right, everybody, for the tipping point this week, we are pleased to be able to welcome 11 new disciples just this week. So here are the disciples: Richard Steenstra, who's being discipled by Rick Shryock; Quan Dukes by Jason Palm; Bud Sorensen, that's one of my new disciples; and then Christopher Sullivan by Tom Seal. Also, we're going to welcome Jerry Vasco, who's being discipled by O'Neill German; Jason Campbell by Adam Skolnick; and Michaela Carrillo by Christy Sullivan. And then we're also welcoming Becky Manring by Christine Militello, who's also discipling Mark Militello, as well as Moises Vasquez by Chris Cassis and Ryan Beld by Ben Lutke. So to all those who are brand new disciples, we want to welcome you. We're glad that you're joining. We're excited about what God's going to do in your life as you become disciple makers. And to all those who are making disciples, a special thanks to you. It is so great that you are giving of yourselves in service of the gospel as you disciple others. A special shout out to O'Neill German, who's a first-time disciple maker. I think this is such a big deal. O'Neill's been a disciple. In fact, he's been a disciple of one of my disciples, Eddie. And now for the first time, he's turning around and what he's been receiving, he's now giving away. And that's such an important moment. This is what we believe. We believe that all disciples are called to be disciple makers. Disciples make disciples. That's what the sign says. And so O'Neill, great job. And then Eddie Nieves is a first-time multiplier. And so, like I said, he's been discipling O'Neill, and now his disciple is discipling someone else. This is also a big deal when you're discipling someone to the point that they begin to disciple someone. You're a first-time multiplier. Great job. We're proud of you. Thank you, Eddie. This brings the total number of disciples made to 653. This number just keeps on growing. If you're watching week by week, you can see that we're multiplying. Things are on the move here, so I think that's great. And for everyone involved, a special shout out to you. There are people who are working away at this every single week. You're the owners of this ministry. You're the ones that God's called and is working in. And my job, I just want to encourage everyone. So let's keep going. If you're interested in joining, we encourage you to reach out and contact us. We have room for you. We'd love for you to get involved. At any rate, that is the end of this segment. And now, Jake, we're going to turn to our next segment, which is Ordinary People. Here we go. So I'm joined by my friend, Greg Hauenstein. And Greg is a friend of mine. We've started a discipling relationship together through 222 Disciple. But Greg is the founder and president of Mintz Seminary, which we'll spend some more time talking about. And one of the reasons I want to interview you, Greg, is that you actually, in the course of our time knowing each other, you handed me a book, the Starfish and Spider book, which we spent some time talking about already in an earlier segment. But I thought it was so profound. And what I've come to learn is that Mintz Seminary really wound up being patterned off of a lot of the concepts that are in this book. And as a result, it's a distributed and decentralized seminary with centers all over the world. And anyway, welcome. I'd just like to welcome you, but I'd love to hear your story. How did you get Mintz started? And tell us about Mintz Seminary.
Well, thank you. It started in the year 2000. We did some preliminary work trying to research how to do a seminary. We were starting one from scratch in Miami. And as we looked at it, we thought, wow, this is quite a big undertaking. There's a lot to be done. We called in experts to advise us, and our experts all said, don't do it. We thought, oh, well, that's not very encouraging. So we said, well, why? And they said, well, you need $1 million in the bank. You need to have 35,000 volumes in your library. You need a building. You need all kinds of things that we didn't have any of these things. So we sat down as a group and said, well, what did the early church do? If we try to do a traditional seminary, we will fail. We don't have all those things. But the early church didn't have that either. So how was it that they trained people, and how was it that it grew across the world? And so we began to look at that and say, it's not rocket science when you get right down to it. It's people sharing the word of God with each other and passing that on. And so we said, well, we can do seminary, we can get the courses, we can get the information, but why can't we do this ourselves? We can. We don't have any money, but that's okay. We don't have to charge anything because we're not dependent on funds. We'll raise our own support just like missionaries have. We'll be missionary professors. And so we launched. We had 30 people in one class, in one study center. And
this was in Miami at the time.
This was in Miami. I thought, if we're going to do it, we need to do it in Spanish because more than half of Miami speaks Spanish.
Right.
And a lot of them speak French. So we started classes in Creole as well. We were pretty excited about that because our philosophy was not to gather everybody in one central location, but to take the education to them. So we would take the professors to their communities, Little Havana, Little Haiti, different locations, and teach there and do our studies there. We thought that was pretty neat. We liked doing that.
Yeah.
And the students liked it because you can't travel across Miami at traffic time. It's just not possible. So
right.
We did it in their community at times that they could be there. They responded really well. To make a long story short, we started getting calls from Latin America saying, hey, you're teaching in downtown Miami in Spanish. How about coming over and teaching us? I thought, hey, that's cool. We could do that. So we began to fly to these other locations and teach. And then we thought about it and realized two things. Number one, we can't afford to do this. We don't have any money. We can't afford all these plane tickets. And number two, we realized that's bad missiology. This is not the way the church did it. This is not the way we should be doing it. What we should be doing is not making the education about us and centered around here we are bringing this to you like a product, but the real Christian thing to do is to go there and teach them to become the future professors for their own people. And so we changed our philosophy, even though we weren't very old at that point, and said we need to make this about multiplying them to reach their own people in their language, in their culture, in their heart, so that it's not our seminary, it becomes their seminary.
Now, at the time, you hadn't read this book, Starfish's spider book, but you grasped this idea of multiplication. Do you know, can you trace out, do you remember where you got this idea? We're going to multiply this seminary?
Yes, it came upon us somewhat gradually. We kind of built our seminary around the idea of Matthew 28 and 2 Timothy 2:2. And we said, nobody's really kind of carrying this on. We know what discipleship is, but why isn't there discipleship in a theological setting, in a seminary education? Isn't it our real purpose and the greatest service to the kingdom to develop people who can develop other people, who can teach these doctrines to other people, and then pass it on from there? We're training the leaders of churches. If they don't get this, it's not going to go anywhere in their people. But if we can get this right, then they can train their people to do this, or at least pass these things on. And so early on, we came up with the multiplication central core value of who we are.
And, okay, just to fast forward, today, how many different Mintz centers are there around the world?
About 350.
Okay.
These are all independently owned things, though they're allied to us philosophically.
Right.
And we don't financially support them, but we administratively support them.
And really now, thousands of students.
Yes. Somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 students, depending on how we want to count them. And that's what we have. We have 4,300 graduates at this point.
And I just find this model so remarkable because it started small with just 30 people, as you mentioned, but because you had this idea of multiplying, that those you would teach could teach others who would teach others who would teach others, you've been able to create an organization, and I don't think there's another seminary like this. If there is, I haven't heard about it, that is now distributed across planet Earth in a decentralized model that just keeps multiplying again and again and again.
And during this process, after we were going for a while, someone that I ran into said, hey, that's kind of like that business book, Spider and the Starfish. I'd never read it or heard of it. He says, you ought to check that out. So I sat down and I read it and I was like mesmerized. These people are saying exactly what we were trying to do. We didn't know that they had this book in existence, but this decentralization and teaching them, all the starfish out there, which you may want to explain, to go out and to keep multiplying and keep going forward like an army rather than just one entity. What could be better than that? That's how Christianity has spread around the world anyway.
Yes. Now, and is there like an organizational capacity that you say, man, we're about to reach it? Or is this something that you think is going to be able to keep multiplying as you go along?
We designed it to keep multiplying. There are certain electronic wrinkles we have to deal with when it comes to records keeping, but the actual seminaries themselves should keep multiplying, keep going. We've given them all they need to know about administration and how to do this. We offer educational support if they have questions, but they get it.
Yeah.
Of our hundreds of these centers, I've only personally visited half a dozen, maybe a dozen.
Huh.
And we have other people in our organization who also visit, but I'll never meet 98% of these people who are out there doing this. I don't even know their names, but that's okay. We have them all registered.
And everybody's an owner. They've all taken ownership. They own it themselves.
It's kind of an entrepreneurial thing for believers to put together their own seminary, study center as we call them, and take it forward. And they multiply themselves.
Yeah. To me, this is the way forward for the church. We're always talking about upgrading the operating system of the church. It seems to me that this is the way forward. And there's something here where, other seminaries are in decline or they're struggling. Here's a way of training leaders that's just growing and growing and growing.
Here's one little fact about us. Early on, we decided, well, we're going to have seminaries in the 10 largest cities in the world. So we made plans and started working that way. And then we said, this is not working. It's because we realized that we were trying to make something happen that wasn't already God involved. So we sat back and let people come to us, and we haven't been able to keep up with that. So we trust God to bring people in, and he does. Right. And we're just trying to be faithful to teach what we have, and they go out and multiply. It's not for us to force the multiplication. It's to follow the natural flow of the believers.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Anyway, Greg, I really appreciate this interview. I'm so grateful you passed the book on to me. Appreciated getting to know you and the friendship that we have, and I'm excited about what God's going to do. Everyone, thanks for joining us this week. Hope it's been helpful. We're glad that you keep tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to the Disciple Standard podcast. We're so glad you joined us. We encourage you to continue the conversation by joining us on social media. Also, if you want to learn more about the Multiply method or learn about how to take the Multiply pledge, we encourage you to join us on our website at multiply222.com. Have a great day.